no one knew the Vampire King's real name for 500 years, until she said it. The Vampire King sat upon his obsidian throne, watching as another supplicant cowered before him. 5 centuries had passed since he'd ruled the night, and in all that time no one had dared to call him anything but Your Majesty, my Lord, or the Eternal One. Not even he remembered his true name anymore. "Rise," he commanded, his voice like winter wind through dead leaves. The vampire before him, a young one barely a century old, trembled as he stood. "You bring news from the Eastern Covens." "Why, yes, my lord. They pledge their allegiance and offer tribute." The messenger gestured to servants carrying chests of gold and ancient artifacts. The king waved his hand dismissively. Gold meant nothing to him. Power meant nothing. For 500 years, he had been the undisputed ruler of the vampire world, and the weight of immortality had become an unbearable crown. He couldn't even remember why he'd wanted power in the first place. After dismissing the messenger, the king wandered through the vast corridors of his castle, a Gothic monstrosity of black stone and stained glass, perched on a mountain peak where the sun never quite seemed to shine. Portraits of himself lined the walls, painted by masters across the centuries, but none of them bore a name, just titles, always titles. His closest advisor, Lucian, approached with quiet footsteps. "The council request your presence, my lord. There are disputes to settle in the Western Territories." "Tell them I'll attend tomorrow night." The king continued walking, his long black coat trailing behind him like a shadow. "My lord, if I may," Lucian hesitated. In 200 years of service he'd learned to read his master's moods. "You seem distant lately." The king stopped, turning to face him. His eyes, silver as moonlight on steel, held centuries of weariness. "Lucian, how long have you served me?" 237 years, my lord." "In all that time, have you ever wondered what my name was? My real name from before?" Lucian's expression showed genuine confusion. "No, my lord, you are the Eternal King. What other name could matter?" The king smiled sadly. "Precisely." He continued his wandering until he reached the highest tower of his castle, where he kept his most private chamber. Here, ancient books lined the walls, journals he'd written over the centuries, attempting to chronicle his existence before the memories faded entirely. Opening the oldest journal, he found pages written in a hand he barely recognized as his own. The ink had faded to brown, the language an archaic dialect rarely spoken anymore. He read fragments of a life lived long ago. "Today she said she loved me. I told her what I am, and still she did not run. The hunters came at dawn. I tried to save her. I failed. I will have revenge. I will have power. I will make sure no one can ever hurt me again." The king closed the book sharply. He remembered the pain but not the details, not her face, not her voice, and certainly not the name she'd called him, whispered in love before the world took her away. That was when he'd stopped being whoever he was, and became simply the king. A knock at the door interrupted his brooding. "Enter," he called, expecting Lucian. Instead, a young woman stepped into the chamber, and the king immediately sensed something wrong. She was human, her heartbeat gave her away, but she walked into his presence without fear, without the thrall of compulsion that usually brought mortals to his castle. She was tall and lean, with copper-coloured skin and hair cut short like a warrior's. Her eyes were the deep brown of rich earth, and they studied him with curious intelligence rather than terror. "You're not supposed to be here," the king said, rising from his chair. "How did you get past the guards?" "I walked past them," she said simply. "They didn't seem to see me." Impossible. His guards were ancient vampires with senses that could detect a mouse's heartbeat from a mile away. Yet here stood this human woman in simple travelling clothes, very much alive and very much uninvited. "What's your name?" he demanded. "Myra," she said, "and I've come a very long way to find you." "Why?" She reached into her satchel, and instantly the king tensed, ready to strike if she pulled out a weapon. But instead she withdrew an old book, its cover worn and cracked with age. "Because I found this in my grandmother's things after she died. It's a journal written by someone who knew you, someone who loved you, I think." Myra held it out to him. "Before you became this." The king stared at the book as if it were a serpent. I don't know what game you're playing, mortal, but... Your name is Kieran, Myra said softly. The world stopped. 500 years of silence shattered in an instant. The king, Kieran, felt something crack inside his chest, like ice breaking after an endless winter. The name resonated through him, awakening memories he thought were lost forever. Kieran. He saw flashes, a small village, a blacksmith's forge, a woman with dark hair and kind eyes teaching him to read. His mother. He remembered being young, being human, being someone who had dreams beyond power and revenge. How, he whispered, his voice breaking, how do you know that name? Myra stepped closer, fearless still, because the woman who wrote this journal was named Sylvie, and she was your sister. The king, Kieran, felt his knees weaken. He had no sister. He'd had no family for 500 years. They'd all died, lost to time and his own deliberate forgetting. But Myra opened the journal and read aloud. My brother Kieran left today. He says he must hunt the monsters that killed Catherine. I fear I will never see him again. I fear he will become the very thing he hunts. But I will write this so that someone someday might remember who he was before the darkness took him. He was kind. He was gentle. He loved deeply and laughed easily. He was my brother and I loved him. Tears, the first in 5 centuries, burned in Kieran's eyes. He remembered. Gods help him, he remembered it all. Sylvie, younger by 3 years, always following him around the village, and Catherine, the baker's daughter, who'd smiled at him like he was the only person in the world. The hunters had killed her when they discovered what he was, newly turned, still learning control. They'd burned her alive to draw him out. In his rage and grief he'd slaughtered them all. Then he'd slaughtered their families. Then their entire village. The power grew with each kill and the pain lessened. So he'd kept going, building an empire of night to fill the void where his heart used to be. And somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten he'd ever been Kieran at all. Why did you come here? He asked Myra, his voice hoarse. Why bring this to me now? Myra met his eyes steadily. Because Sylvie's journal has been passed down through our family for generations. She made us promise that one day someone would find you and remind you. She wrote that you deserved to remember who you were, even if you'd become a monster. She believed that names have power and that maybe, just maybe, if someone spoke yours again, you might find your way back. Back to what? I'm not that person anymore. Kieran died 500 years ago. Did he? Myra challenged. Or did you just bury him under centuries of anger and loneliness? Before Kieran could answer, the chamber doors burst open. Lucian rushed in, followed by guards. My lord, forgive the intrusion, but we've detected a human in the castle. He stopped, seeing Myra. There, seize her. The guards moved forward, but Kieran raised his hand. Stop. They froze instantly, trained to obey without question. This woman is under my protection, Kieran declared. She is not to be harmed. Lucian, prepare chambers for her. She will be my guest. Lucian's eyes widened in shock. In 200 years, the king had never taken a human guest. Prisoners, yes, meals occasionally, but never a protected guest. My lord is that wise. The council will question. The council will do as I command, Kieran said coldly, or they will find themselves without a king to question. Now go. Lucian bowed stiffly and withdrew with the guards, leaving Kieran alone with Myra once more. You don't have to protect me, Myra said. I didn't come here expecting to leave alive. I came to fulfill Sylvie's wish, nothing more. Sylvie was your ancestor. My great-great-great-great-grandmother, yes. The journal has been passed down through the women of our family. My grandmother gave it to me on her deathbed and made me swear I would find you. Myra smiled sadly. I thought she was delirious. Vampires, a lost king, a forgotten name. It sounded like a fairy tale, but I promised her I would try. Kieran moved to the tower window, looking out over his dark domain. 500 years of rule. Thousands of vampires who called him master. Endless power and endless emptiness. And now this mortal woman had walked through it all to speak a name he'd forgotten, carrying a message from a sister he'd abandoned to preserve his own monstrous existence. What happened to Sylvie? He asked quietly. Myra came to stand beside him. She lived a long life according to the journal. She married a merchant, had children, died peacefully at 73, but she never stopped hoping you'd come back to yourself. She wrote entries for years, telling you about her life, asking you questions, reminding you of your childhood together. It's all in here. She held up the journal. She wanted you to know that someone remembered, someone still loved you even after everything. The weight of 5 centuries pressed down on Kieran. He thought he'd severed all connections to his humanity, that he transcended the weakness of mortal emotion. But hearing about Sylvie, knowing she'd lived and died still thinking of him, cracked something fundamental in the fortress he'd built around his heart. "I don't deserve this," he said. "Probably not," Myra agreed. "But Sylvie didn't do it because you deserved it. She did it because she loved you. Love isn't about deserving." Kieran turned to look at her properly. In the moonlight streaming through the window, he could see it, a faint resemblance to Sylvie in the shape of her jaw, the directness of her gaze. Family, his family, however distant. "You look like her," he said. "Not exactly, but something in your eyes." Myra smiled. "Everyone says I have her stubbornness. It's apparently genetic." Walking alone into the Vampire King's castle certainly suggests stubbornness, or madness. Maybe both. Despite everything, Kieran felt the corner of his mouth twitch. How long since he'd smiled genuinely, not the cold smirk he gave his enemies or the diplomatic expression he wore for politics, but a real smile. "Too long. You should rest," he said. "We'll talk more tomorrow night." "Will I be allowed to leave?" Myra asked. "Tomorrow or whenever I wish." Kieran considered lying, considered keeping her here as leverage or simply because she represented something he'd thought lost forever. But Sylvie's sister's descendant deserved better than that. "Yes," he said, "you may leave whenever you choose. You came here freely to deliver a message from someone I loved. The least I can do is respect that courage." Myra studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you, Kieran." Hearing his name again sent another shock through his system. He realized he wanted to hear it more, wanted to reclaim the identity he'd buried for so long. But wanting something and being able to have it were very different things. As Myra left to be shown to her chambers, Kieran sat alone with Sylvie's journal. He opened it with trembling hands and began to read his sister's words, written across decades of a life he'd never known she lived. And for the first time in 500 years, the Vampire King wept. Kieran didn't sleep that day. Vampires needed little rest, and he'd long ago mastered the art of remaining active through the daylight hours within his castle's protected walls. Instead, he read Sylvie's journal from beginning to end, then started again, absorbing every detail of the life his sister had lived without him. Kieran would have loved the harvest festival this year. He always did enjoy the dancing, even if he pretended he didn't. "I had a son today. I named him Kieran after my brother. I hope wherever he is he knows I haven't forgotten him. I'm old now and my time grows short. If anyone reads this, please find my brother. Tell him that I forgave him long ago. Tell him that I understood why he left. Tell him that he is still loved, still remembered, still human enough to come home." By the time night fell again, Kieran had memorized every word. The journal painted a picture of Sylvie's life, joys and sorrows, children and grandchildren, ordinary human struggles and triumphs. She'd thought of him throughout it all, wondering if he still existed, hoping he'd find peace. She died 300 years ago, and he'd never known. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter." Myra stepped in, looking remarkably composed for someone spending a night in a castle full of vampires. She'd been given new clothes, dark trousers and a simple shirt, practical rather than decorative. "Did you read it?" she asked. "Every word, multiple times." "And—" Kieran closed the journal gently. "And I don't know what to feel, grief for time lost, anger at myself for abandoning her, gratitude that she lived well." He met Myra's eyes. "How is it possible that you're here? Sylvie died centuries ago." The journal became a family tradition. Each generation's task was to add to it and keep searching for you. Myra sat down across from him. "My grandmother was obsessed with it. She spent 50 years researching vampire legends, tracking rumors of the Eternal King. When she finally pieced together that you were Sylvie's brother, she was too old to make the journey herself. So she sent you." "I volunteered. Grandmother's stories made Kieran seem real, human. I wanted to know if there was any truth to the legend, if the Monster King really had been someone's brother once. Kieran stood and walked to the window. Beyond the glass his domain stretched out, a city of eternal night where thousands of vampires lived under his rule. He'd built all of this, created order from chaos, become a legend that would outlast empires. But Sylvie had built something too, a family, a legacy of love passed down through generations, culminating in this brave young woman who'd walked into darkness to speak a forgotten name. "What do you see when you look at me, Myra?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Honestly, I see someone who's been in pain for so long that he's forgotten what it feels like not to hurt." Kieran flinched. In 500 years, no one had read him so accurately. "The vampires in the lower city whisper about you," Myra continued. "They respect you, fear you, obey you, but they don't know you. I asked several of them about your history, and no one could tell me anything beyond legends. The eternal king who rose from nothing to rule all vampire kind. The one who cannot be challenged, cannot be killed, cannot be understood. That's what I wanted them to see." "Why?" "Because knowing someone gives them power over you. Caring about someone makes you vulnerable." Kieran turned to face her. "I loved Catherine with everything I had, and when she died, the pain nearly destroyed me. I loved Sylvie, and I left her behind because I couldn't bear to see her fear me or worse, to watch her age and die while I remained unchanged. I learned that the only way to survive eternity is to stop caring." "That's not surviving," Myra said gently. "That's just existing. There's a difference." Before Kieran could respond, Lucian appeared at the door. "My lord, the council has assembled. They're concerned about your guest." Kieran sighed. He'd known this was coming. "Tell them I'll address their concerns tonight. They request that the human not attend." "Then they'll be disappointed. Myra stays with me." Lucian's expression was carefully neutral. "As you wish, my lord." After he left, Myra raised an eyebrow. "Should I be worried about this council?" "Probably. They're the oldest and most powerful vampires in my domain, and they're not accustomed to being kept in the dark about my decisions." Kieran offered her his hand. "But if you've come this far, you might as well see how vampire politics work." The council chamber was a vast circular room deep in the castle's heart, lit by hundreds of candles that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. 13 thrones ringed the space, each occupied by an ancient vampire whose power radiated like cold fire. Kieran took his place at the highest throne, with Myra standing beside him, a statement that didn't go unnoticed. The council members exchanged glances, their ageless faces showing various degrees of confusion and displeasure. Lady Morgrave spoke first. She was the oldest after Kieran, nearly 800 years old, with silver hair and eyes like chips of ice. "My lord, we must protest. Bringing a human into our council chambers is unprecedented and potentially dangerous. What if she carries weapons blessed by priests? What if she's a spy for the hunters?" "She carries nothing but an old journal," Kieran said calmly. "And if she were a spy, she would have been discovered long before reaching my private chambers." "Then why is she here?" demanded Lord Corvus, his scarred face twisted in suspicion. "What value does a mortal have to our kind?" Kieran felt Myra tense beside him, but was impressed when she spoke up herself. "I have value because I know something none of you do," she said clearly. "I know your king's real name." The chamber erupted. Vampires hissed and shouted, their voices overlapping in chaos. Kieran let it continue for a moment before raising his hand for silence. The noise died instantly. "It's true," he said into the quiet that followed. "This woman knows my name, my birth name from before I became what I am. She carries a journal written by my sister, chronicling my human life." Lady Morgrave leaned forward. "You never mentioned having a sister, my lord." "I never mentioned having a life before becoming king. I buried that past deliberately, thinking it made me stronger. But Myra has reminded me of something I'd forgotten, that even we immortals come from somewhere. We all had names once before the titles and the power." "Knowing your true name could give enemies power over you," Lord Corvus warned. "Ancient magic binds to birth names. You've protected yourself by keeping it secret." "Or I've limited myself," Kieran countered. 500 years I've ruled without remembering who I was. 500 years of power without purpose, victory without joy, existence without meaning. Perhaps it's time that changed. Master Thuron, a scholarly vampire who served as the council's historian, spoke thoughtfully. My lord, if I may ask, what was your name? Kieran looked at Myra, who gave him an encouraging nod. He took a breath he didn't need and spoke the name that had been lost for centuries. Kieran, my name was Kieran Ashford, born in a village that no longer exists, to a family long since turned to dust. I was a blacksmith's son who fell in love with a baker's daughter. I became a monster to avenge her death, and in doing so, I forgot I'd ever been anything else. The silence in the chamber was absolute. These ancient creatures who'd known him for centuries stared as if seeing him for the first time. Why reveal this now? Lady Morgrave asked, her tone softer than before. Because I'm tired, Kieran admitted. Tired of being a legend instead of a person. Tired of ruling without remembering why I wanted power in the first place. Tired of existing in an endless present without past or future. He stood, and the council instinctively straightened in their seats. I'm not abdicating, he said firmly, but I am changing. Myra came here on a mission that her family has pursued for 300 years to remind me of my humanity. She succeeded. Now I must decide what to do with that knowledge. Lord Corvus stood as well. My lord, we have followed you for centuries because you were strong, unwavering, and merciless when necessary. If you become soft, there are those who might see it as weakness. Let them try, Kieran said, and despite his words about change, his eyes flashed with the cold power that had made him king. I am still the same vampire who united the clans, who ended the wars, who has held power for 500 years. Remembering my name doesn't change that, but it might help me remember why that power matters. He looked around the chamber at each council member. You've served me loyally and I value that, but understand this, Myra is under my protection for as long as she chooses to stay. Any who threaten her threaten me. Is that clear? A chorus of yes, my lord, echoed through the chamber. As the council dispersed, Master Thuron approached. Unlike the others, his expression showed curiosity rather than concern. Kieran Ashford, he said, testing the name. It suits you better than the Eternal King, I think. You don't fear that this revelation weakens me? On the contrary, I've studied history for 6 centuries, my lord, and I've learned that the most dangerous leaders are those who understand both their power and their limitations. You've always known your power. Perhaps knowing your origins will help you understand your purpose. After Thuron left, Myra finally relaxed. That was intense. Welcome to vampire politics. It only gets more complicated from here. They walked together through the castle corridors, and Kieran found himself showing her things he'd never bothered sharing with anyone else. The library where he kept books from dead civilizations, the gallery of paintings he'd collected, the observatory where he charted stars that mortals wouldn't discover for centuries. You've built something incredible here, Myra observed as they stood in the observatory, starlight streaming through the glass dome above. It's not just a kingdom, it's a preservation of knowledge, art, culture. I had to do something with eternity, Kieran said. Conquering only takes you so far. After that you need something else to fill the time. But you did it alone. I did. Why? Kieran was quiet for a long moment. Because everyone I've ever cared about has died or been taken from me. Catherine, Sylvie, even the few vampires I considered friends in the early years, all gone. After a while it seemed easier not to get attached. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard, Myra said softly. It's practical. Emotions are liabilities for immortals. No, Myra turned to face him fully. Emotions are what make existence worthwhile. Sylvie lived 73 years, and she packed more life, love, and meaning into that time than you have in 500 years of immortal existence. Not because she was better than you, but because she let herself feel things. She let herself care, even knowing she'd lose people, even knowing everything was temporary. And she's dead now while I remain. Yes, Myra agreed, but which of you actually lived? The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable and profound. Kieran wanted to argue, to defend the choices he'd made, the walls he'd built. But standing here with this descendant of his sister, looking at stars he'd watched for centuries without really seeing them, He couldn't find the words. "Tell me about your life," he said instead. "Sylvie's journal ended with her death. What came after?" So Myra told him. She spoke of her grandmother who'd devoted her life to finding him, her mother who'd been skeptical but supported the family tradition anyway, her own childhood, growing up on stories of the lost vampire king who'd once been someone's beloved brother. "I'm a historian," she explained. "I teach at a university specializing in folklore and oral traditions. When grandmother gave me Sylvie's journal, it felt like all my training had been preparation for this moment, a real historical mystery passed down through my own family. And if I'd killed you when you arrived, then I would have died fulfilling a 300-year-old promise. There are worse ways to go." Kieran shook his head in amazement. "You're either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish." "Sylvie's stubbornness, remember." They talked through the night, and Kieran found himself sharing things he'd never spoken aloud. Memories of his human childhood that reading Sylvie's journal had unlocked. The early years of his vampire existence, when rage and grief had driven him to build power as a shield against feeling anything else. The slow realization that he'd become exactly what he'd once hunted. "Do you regret it?" Myra asked, "becoming this?" "I regret what I did to become this. The people I killed, the humanity I discarded. But the vampire part itself," Kieran considered. "No, I was dying when I was turned, attacked by a rogue vampire left for dead. Another vampire, an ancient one named Seraphina, found me and offered a choice, die as a human or live as something else. I chose to live, thinking I could go back to Catherine, protect her from anything." "But you couldn't." "No, she saw what I'd become and was frightened, but she loved me anyway. She said we'd find a way to make it work." Kieran's voice grew distant. "The hunters didn't give us the chance. They burned her alive to lure me out, knowing I'd come for her. I did, and I slaughtered them all. After that, there was no going back to any kind of normal existence." "What happened to Seraphina, the one who turned you?" "She tried to teach me control, to show me how to live as a vampire without losing myself. But I was too consumed by vengeance. I left her to pursue power, to make myself strong enough that no one could ever hurt me again. I heard she was killed in the wars between vampire clans, about 200 years ago." Myra was quiet for a moment. "So everyone who knew you as Kieran, really knew you, is gone?" "Until you arrived, yes." "That must be incredibly lonely." Kieran looked at her, surprised by the simple compassion in her voice. Not pity, not fear, just understanding. "It is," he admitted, "more than I've allowed myself to acknowledge." As dawn approached, Kieran escorted Myra back to her chambers. At the door, she paused. "What happens now?" she asked. "I've delivered Sylvie's message. I've spoken your name and reminded you of your past. My duty is fulfilled. Do you want to leave?" Myra met his eyes. "I don't know. Part of me wants to run back to my normal life, write a paper about this experience that no one would ever believe. But another part of me is curious. You're starting to remember who you were. I'd like to see who you become." "It might be dangerous. Not everyone will approve of these changes." "I walked into the Vampire King's castle alone. I think I've proven I'm not afraid of danger." Kieran smiled, a real smile, the second one in as many nights. "Sylvie's stubbornness indeed. Very well, stay as long as you like. But I warn you, vampire politics are tedious, my counsel is suspicious, and I'm not entirely sure I remember how to be the person you're hoping to find." "Maybe that's okay," Myra said. "Maybe you're not supposed to become who you were. Maybe you're supposed to become someone new, someone who remembers the past but isn't trapped by it." After she went inside, Kieran stood alone in the corridor, turning her words over in his mind. 500 years of being the eternal king, untouchable and unchanging. And now, in just 2 nights, a mortal woman had shaken the foundations of everything he'd built. He should send her away, he knew, for her safety and his own. Every instinct honed over centuries screamed that caring about her was dangerous, that letting anyone close was inviting pain. But for the first time in 500 years, Kieran found he didn't want to listen to those instincts. He wanted to remember how to be human, even if he could never truly be human again. And perhaps with Myra's help he could learn. 3 weeks passed, and the castle felt different. The change was subtle at first. Servants noticed their king walking the halls with less weight in his step. Council members observed him smiling during meetings. Ancient vampires whispered about the human woman who dined with the king each night and still lived. Kieran found himself anticipating sunset not because it meant power and control, but because it meant time with Myra. They'd fallen into a routine. She explored the castle and its extensive libraries during the early evening, then they'd meet for dinner. She ate while he kept her company, and afterward they'd talk for hours. Full story is on my website, link in description. It's completely free, no sign-up required. Go and watch the complete ending.